while ago, though.
Yeah.
I've been in Boston ever since I went to college. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. Welcome to Behind the Pages. Tammy Bottner is with us today to talk about Among the Reeds. This is a book that chronicles her family's survival of Nazi-occupied Europe and the lasting damage that it caused that has really been handed down through the generations. Welcome, Tammy.
Thanks for having me.
So this is your first book.
Yeah.
You primarily work as a pediatrician, but I know you say in the introduction to your book that you really felt the need to write this particular book. Do you want to tell us how that all came about?
Yeah, sure. I've always loved to write, but I was busy, doing other things. And my dad, a few years ago, talked to me about maybe hiring a ghostwriter to tell this story, which has been in our family for years. And I'd always thought about it, talked about it, but in little bits and pieces. I hadn't ever put it all together. But when he told me he was going to hire a ghostwriter, I just really had this sudden knowledge, that I wanted to write the book myself. And as soon as I made that decision, I decided I'd better interview everybody I can as soon as possible, because most of the survivors are getting on in years. So I flew to Israel, where I interviewed my relatives who were involved with the story, particularly my great uncle, who was 88 at the time.
Wow.
And
which uncle was that?
Nathan.
Okay.
And he's extraordinary. He has this amazing memory, and he had all the dates and names and addresses at his fingertips. So that's really how it came about, and along with the knowledge that survivors are aging out, and I wanted to put all that together while I still could.
Sure. And I think you also said in your introduction that with the birth of your son, you suddenly started finding yourself reliving the trauma that your father and grandparents lived through.
Yeah, it was the strangest thing in the world. My son was born, it's 20 years ago now, and he was a healthy baby, and I was already a pediatrician, and I was comfortable taking care of babies. So unlike many new moms who are very anxious, I didn't really have that. But when I brought him home, I felt like I was having flashbacks. It felt like I was reliving trauma. And what I was experiencing was these sort of obsessive thoughts about what if we were being hunted? What if me and my child were in danger? And where would we go? What would we do? And it was very vivid and very disturbing. I didn't really know what to think about it, and I sort of put it away. And it wasn't until more recently when I started learning about epigenetics, which is the study of how life experiences modify our genes and how those genes are then passed along to the next generation, that I started to think, maybe I did inherit some of that trauma, not the specific memories clearly, but I inherited some of that trauma and some of that predisposition to be anxious about it.
So epigenetics is as a scientific field with research that
So epigenetics, relatively recent, maybe in the last 10 years or so, showing that life experiences, all kinds of life experience, so it could be something really huge, like a major trauma like the Holocaust, but it can also be, dietary choices or exercise choices or lifestyles, for example. Those have an effect on our DNA. And the way that plays out is that our genes are expressed a little bit differently after that event. But there's a growing body of research out of primarily New York City at Mount Sinai. Rachel Yehuda has done some studies looking at Holocaust survivors and their children. So not only did the survivors have altered stress hormones, but their children who did not go through that kind of trauma also have that exact same profile of changes. So it's really, really interesting.
It is, yeah.
And a bit of a change in, you know, when I went to school, maybe when you went to school, we learned DNA was unchanging. You got your genes, boom, that's it forever. But now it's complex, you know. Yes, you get your genes, but what happens to you in your life can modify those.
Right, interesting. As a child, you recall going to Montreal to visit your grandparents and listening in on conversations. Can you tell us about that experience?
Well, whenever my dad got together with his parents, inevitably the conversation would turn to things that had happened during the war. They called it the war. You know, nobody said Holocaust until more recently. It was the war. And I was a kid, you know, they would put me and my sister to bed, and I could hear some of what was being said. And it's interesting because it was sort of in a hybrid of English and Yiddish and German, because they spoke this sort of hybrid language, but I understood enough to know what they were talking about, and it was really, really scary for me as a kid.
Yeah.
I experienced some anxiety about it, and also, you know, almost like some guilt, like it was like, oh, they had to go through this thing. And I think that's a common thing for children of survivors, to feel some responsibility or guilt for what their predecessors had to go through.
Right, and for what they didn't have to go through themselves too. I think.
Right, exactly.
So did you, did you hear very specific information, or was that all information you had to get later through interviews?
A combination. You know, I knew some of the stories. My grandmother told me some things that had happened to her during the war. My dad had also shared with me a little bit of his story and how he was hidden as a child in a convent for 2.5 years. I think I didn't ask that many questions about that. I was just like, as a kid, like,
kind of,
oh my God, okay, you know.
Right.
But as I started to do research for the book, I learned a ton. I learned about how many near misses everybody had. I never knew that until I went to write this book. There were so many instances where something was about to happen that could have been catastrophic, and so somewhat sort of miraculously, it went a different way, like over and over again. That was unbelievable. I couldn't believe what I was finding out.
I mean, there are some very striking tales of survival in your book. That very easily could have gone the other way too.
And those I found out about as I was researching.
Oh, wow. What's your most lasting memory of something your grandmother told you when you were a child? Do you have any one particular
She told me, I don't know that I was a child, I was probably in college, but she told me that when she was 17, her mother said to her, there's going to be a wedding. And she said, oh, whose? And her mother said, yours. And that's how she found out she was getting married. I want to say, you included a photo, her wedding photo, in the book, and it made me laugh. She sure does look mad. She is not happy.
Right.
No, she's not happy. She didn't want to get married. She was 17. She didn't want to marry the man she married, my grandfather. But times were different, and she really didn't have a choice.
And we can get more into the specifics of that in a few minutes, because that was really her mother's way of keeping her safe at that point. It was rough. At one point, your father gave talks to high school students about his perception of his survival, because he was a young child and didn't understand a lot of what was going on at the time. But then he had to stop. Why was this?
He was starting to have flashbacks and nightmares. I think he has always had nightmares once in a while, but when he immerses himself in the experience of what happened to him as a child, the nightmares get worse. And so he gave talks for about a decade, and then he just couldn't do it anymore. He just decided he was done.
It's too damaging to him.
It's too hard.
Well, he also was only 2 when he was first sent away. So although he was verbal, he didn't speak the language of the convent that he was hidden in.
That's right.
So his impressions kind of, in a way that creates a different impression and damage in a child, because it comes at them in a different way. It sort of does become more, I think, encoded in their DNA if they're not verbal enough to be able to ask questions, and their experience is sort of all based on what's happening but not understanding.
I don't think he had any idea what was going on. He told me he thought that he had been like a bad boy, and that's why his parents sent him away. I mean, very age-appropriate response to something that was beyond his comprehension. His experience in the convent, he remembers and he doesn't remember. I mean, I think he really shut down. He was basically living in sensory deprivation for 2.5 years.
Yeah.
Very lonely, very isolated, and the reason for that, of course, was that the nuns who were hiding the children were terribly afraid that if Nazi soldiers came to the convent, if they heard kids running around and playing, that they would go and investigate who are these children.
Yes.
So they had to keep quiet, and you know, they were in the dark, and it was terrible, basically horrible.
Yeah.
So yes, I think he, you know, he processed that as a toddler would process it.
Yes.
And and that's all he could do at that time. Yeah.
Your grandmother Melly is quite a character. She talks about how, as you write the book, you know, from her perspective, I'm assuming it's, you know, through the information you gathered as you were doing interviews, about how she perceived herself as a disappointment to her father from the moment she was born, because she was born a girl and not a boy, which is what he wanted.
Yeah.
And that sort of shaped the kind of person that she was. She was very pessimistic.
Yes.
How do you? What are your memories of her? Did that remain with her?
You know, she wasn't an easy person. She always was intense, somewhat moody, and I saw that in her. She wasn't a bubbly, you know, light kind of personality. She was an intense, serious person. But very caring, very loving to me and my sister, and my father she absolutely adored. Like, you know, that comes out in the book.
Yes.
And she always adored her son. But yes, she had her demons for sure.
Yeah, yeah. That started well before the war.
Before the war, and it's hard to say, right? Because we're born with a certain personality. She may never have been destined to be you know,
upbeat or positive, or
a bubbly, you know, optimist. But I'm certain that the events of the war, being married off at 17, being uprooted from her home multiple times, the hardship of giving up her children, the terrible trauma she went through as a very, very young woman. I mean, when the war was over, she was in her early 20s.
Wow.
You know, so obviously a lot happened.
Yeah. And even when she was a child, actually, why don't you tell us about this? Because she grew up wealthy, with servants and...
Yes, so she grew up in Germany, in a town called Chemnitz, or city called Chemnitz, that was in what would later be East Germany. And it was a big industrial center, and her father was a businessman, and he had a factory that made socks and gloves, textiles. And the business did well, and yes, they accumulated some degree of wealth and moved to a bigger house when she was a young girl, and had a governess and, you know, ballet lessons and piano lessons, and, you know, living kind of a, you know, an upper middle class existence. And all of that ground to a halt basically overnight. In January of 1933, Hitler came to power. But it was very early on, and most people didn't think that he would be as bad as he was, that they sort of thought he was a buffoon, an idiot, and you know,
no one would really take him seriously.
Exactly, and that it would sort of pass.
Sounding familiar.
Sounds familiar, a little bit too familiar.
Yeah.
But my grandmother's father was very afraid of him. And one morning he woke up and said he'd had a dream that the brown shirts, which was the militant Nazi stormtroopers, were coming for him. And it was March of 1933. Nobody was really doing anything like this yet. And he woke up.
And she was how old at that point?
She was 11.
Okay.
And he woke up in the morning and he said to his wife, "The Nazis are coming for me, I'm leaving." And my great-grandmother said, "What are you talking about?
Yeah.
We have, you know, a house, we have a business, we have children, we have a family here. Where are you going?" And he was like, "No, I'm leaving." And he literally went to the train station and took the train to Holland, leaving his wife and 3 young kids and his business and his house and everything. And this is one of the things I learned. A day or 2 later, in fact, the Nazis did come to the door looking for him.
Yeah.
And they ransacked the house. And long story, you know, that was basically the end of my grandmother's existence in Germany. The next day, they escaped out the back door and also went to the train station and got on a train to Holland. And that was the end of that.
Yeah.
And they were penniless and destitute and homeless.
How did they connect back up again? There weren't like
I don't
phones
know.
or
Yeah, that was something I could never
wondering
figure
that
out
when I was
because
reading the
no
book.
one's around to tell me, but
Yeah.
they
Somehow,
did
yeah.
through probably some connection that they had. But yeah, my great-grandmother did find her husband and they reunited with the kids and lived in Holland for several years. Later moving to Belgium.
Yeah. We don't know how or why, but at some point your great-grandfather developed mental illness to the point that he could no longer
Live
be
at
at home or live at, can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So he wasn't diagnosed the way we would be diagnosed now. You know, my impression is that maybe he had schizophrenia or bad bipolar, but he apparently had delusions and was increasingly mentally ill in the years preceding the war. I suspect that the trauma of having to flee Germany exacerbated his mental illness, but that's just my theory. Yeah, so in 1937, he, the decision was made by the family that he should go to the hospital. And in those days, it wasn't a 3-day turnaround. It was a very prolonged stay. And in fact, he stayed in the hospital for the rest of his life. And
that was in Holland, is that correct?
The hospital was in Holland, right? It was the only Jewish mental hospital in that part of Europe. So even though the family was living in Belgium, he went up to Holland and he was hospitalized. And the hospital, I looked it up, I did a lot of research about it. It was enormous. It looked like a huge hotel in the middle of the woods. At one point, it housed 900 patients.
Wow.
It's huge. And was one of the best mental institutions in Europe at the time. And he lived there. And sometimes his family would come up and see him. But he never left until the Nazis came in 1943 and sent him to Auschwitz.
And then your great-grandmother, was left with 3 children.
Yeah.
She'd never worked before.
No.
Yeah. What did she do?
So she everyone was so resourceful. I mean, I guess you don't know what you can do until you have to do it, right?
Yeah.
But she hadn't worked before. She had 3 young kids that were, the eldest was 11. No, it was 16 at the time. So they were like 10 to 16.
Yeah.
And she was in Belgium and she had to feed them and house them. So she decided to open up a bakery. It was sort of a satellite bakery of another bakery called Jaludzinski's Bakery that was in downtown Brussels, Antwerp rather.
Oh, yes.
Antwerp. And she opened up this bakery, and my grandmother, who was a teenager, her job was to take her bicycle and every morning go to the main bakery, load up her bike with pastries, and then cycle those pastries to the smaller bakery her mother was opening up. So that they would have the goods to sell. Yeah. So that's how that worked out. And my grandmother ended up working in the bakery with her mother, and that's where my grandfather actually saw her.
Yes.
He saw her cycling.
Saw a pretty young
followed
girl.
her, and became a customer at the bakery, trying to flirt with her when she ignored him.
Yes, right. Do you want to tell us a little bit about him? How did he end up in Belgium?
Right, so that's an amazing story too. He grew up in a city called Lvov, which is in what is now the Ukraine. At the time it was Poland. And he was one of 4 boys growing up in a very working class family. And he was a soccer player. in the mid-1930s, he had an opportunity to travel with his soccer team for the first time to go out of the country, and they went to Belgium. And when he was in Belgium, he was just absolutely flabbergasted by what life was like in Western Europe. And he was with a friend on his team, and his friend said to him, Genek, you know, we shouldn't go back to Lvov, we should stay here. But my grandfather said, I can't do that to my family. You know, I can't just disappear. So he did go back to Lvov, but the two guys thought about what it had been like in Belgium for a long time. And about a year or two after that initial trip, they did in fact leave.
Yeah, but they weren't exactly free to get on a train and leave by then,
No, they
right?
weren't. So by then, Hitler was in power in Germany. Of course, Germany is right between Poland and Belgium. So they had to travel illegally. Primarily they walked. Probably, and I don't know this for sure, but it makes sense that they would have gone south through Czechoslovakia as much as possible in order to get to Belgium. But they walked, the two young men, because they had no documentation to get on a train, as you said, and there were all kinds of border crossings and guards and things, various places, so they just had to keep a low profile, sleeping in the fields, being out in the elements, and it's 1,000 miles. And he walked 1,000 miles eventually, setting himself up in Belgium, where he had to also change careers because he had been a bookkeeper in Lvov, but he couldn't really find work in that field, so he became a furrier, and he made fur coats. And that's what he did forever after that. And
then at his, actually one other thing, now where your grandmother was a very pessimistic person, he was basically an optimist, wasn't he?
Yeah. He was a very, he was very funny. You know, everything was a joke. So he had all these little jokes. He would always, you know, play little jokes, and he had these little like one-liners. He would always say, like, you know, he'd say to me, Tamale, if you eat chicken every day for 100 years, you'll live a long time, you know, things like that. So, and but he was a very kind of jovial character. He definitely had his tough side too. He was very strong-willed and stubborn, but for him, life was more playful, and my grandmother was more serious.
And what was the age gap between the two?
10 years.
10 years. Okay. So she was suddenly told she was marrying this young man, because she, her mother didn't really feel she could keep her safe anymore.
That's right.
Yeah. So
so they got married, and you know, she was only 17, and she became pregnant right away. And so in April of 1940, she gave birth to my dad, April 23rd. And on May 10th, 1940, the Nazis occupied Belgium. So she only had 3 weeks before, you know, the relative safety of Belgium was no more. And pandemonium happened when Belgium fell. Everybody tried to flee, and they tried to go to
They literally
England
picked up
or
their little
France.
3-year-old.
They took their 3-week-old. They got on a train that was going, you know, very slowly because it was chaos, and there were German planes bombing and refugees everywhere and people on the streets. Everybody's like in a panic. They got as far as the French border, but they weren't able to stay in France, and so they got turned back. And weirdly, you know, the Nazi soldiers at that time, their directive was to be nice and to mollify the occupied countries. So they were not the sadistic, you know, people they would become. In fact, they gave them a ride. They gave my grandparents and their infant a ride back to Antwerp in a military truck.
And what was it like for Jews in that part of Belgium? Because I know you talk about the difference in terms of the Flemish people that were there, and then when they eventually went to Brussels.
Right. So Belgium's a tiny country, right? But it has two separate cultures in it. It has the French, which is where Brussels is in the south, and the Flemish, which is more like the Dutch in the north, and the main city in that part is Antwerp. They're only about an hour away from each other, though, by driving. So initially Antwerp is where they went, and that had a very large Jewish community, and that's why they went there. But as the Nazi occupation evolved, that part of the country, the Flemish part of the country, became increasingly anti-Semitic. And one thing I actually found out that my family didn't know, or it never came down through the stories, is that in 1941 there was a huge pogrom in Antwerp.
Oh.
Right. And so, and after that, the Jewish community was basically expelled from that part of this country. My dad always said, yeah, we moved to Brussels, I don't know why. That's why. So they had to, again, you know, uproot, relocate, and move to Brussels. And Brussels is, that part of the country, the French-Belgian part, for whatever reason, that community was amazing in terms of trying to help the Jewish refugees and the native Belgian Jews that were living there. You know, taking enormous risks to save people and to save children. So it worked out that they actually ended up in a place of relative safety.
Right.
But having said that, still 50% of Belgian Jews were killed. But 50% in the Holocaust was really as good as it could get.
Yes, right.
Because like where my grandfather was from, it was over 99% perished.
And your grandmother didn't look Jewish, she looked Aryan. And that's part of how she was able to save them, at least for a while.
That and the fact that she spoke perfect German. But yeah, she was young and pretty. She had black hair, but her facial features apparently didn't look Jewish. So she was able to pass as a non-Jewish German. And yes, that absolutely played an enormous role, because she was able to go out into the streets in Belgium and do what needed to be done.
You know,
like
get buy food,
you know, do all the commercial interactions that needed to happen. And in fact, she told me that in one of their apartments, their neighbors thought that she was Gestapo. Because they heard her, they saw her coming and going at weird times, and they heard her speaking German, and so that was actually great, because if someone thought you were a German spy, they wouldn't turn you in as a Jew.
Yes, right, absolutely, yes.
My grandfather, however, you know, had a very strong Polish accent, and he couldn't pass.
Yes, so he had to stay indoors.
Yes.
Well, it's been fascinating talking to you, and your book really gives so much more detail. It's quite gripping. So I want to thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You've been watching Behind the Pages from the staff of 22 City View. I'm Diane Goshgarian. Thanks. Yeah, that did speed by as always.
It does.
Yes,
it does.
yes, yeah. No, but it is just fascinating, and just the heartbreak again after, you know, when you've been a mom, and the idea of giving away your 2-year-old to save their life is just, it's unbearable. Horrifying.